Hello, and welcome to Minding the Forest, a podcast of the Louisiana Forestry Association. I'm your host, Jeff Zeringue. In Minding the Forest, we talk about how important sustainable forestry is for everyone, how it benefits our economy, and the importance of keeping forests as forests. If you'd like to get notifications when a new episode of Minding the Forest is released, click on subscribe on your favorite podcast directory, such as Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, or Spotify, and you'll know when a new episode is ready. We release a new episode of Minding the Forest each month. We have with us today John Michael Kelley. He is an amateur botanist. We have discussed stuff in the past with Mr. Kelley in our Forest and People magazine, and we refer to him as a big tree hunter, so we'll get into that. So, John Michael, glad to have you with us.
Thanks. Glad to be here. Tell
us a little bit about yourself. You're from Houghton?
That's right, yeah. We say shallow Houghton. I'm not from the center of town. So okay. I'm not from deep Houghton. I don't want you to hold that against me. So.
I don't think that would be a problem.
Yeah, born and raised.
So tell us a little bit about your journey to become an amateur botanist.
When I was in high school, I was already interested in outdoor skills and things like this. And I always picked up books in the library that people just didn't seem to pick up. And my librarian would just give them to me. So Plant Communities and Their Studies was a book that I picked up. And she said, no one's ever going to read that. Take it away, and Edible Plants of the World, this sort of thing. So I taught at folk schools when I was in high school a little bit. And then I realized there were rare plants out there that people needed to pay attention to. And I didn't know most of them. And so I found a map one day. And the map was of all the natural areas noticed by the state wildlife and fisheries in our state, and all these little yellow dots had a curious connection. They're all my favorite squirrel hunting spots. I said, I don't know what I can see, but I'm seeing something that others can see too. And so I started investigating old forests and unique habitats and rare plants, and found myself here, wherever that is.
Well, one thing that we had discussed earlier was old growth forests. And within the last several months, the federal government has asked USDA to define old growth forests and what they are considered, how you to describe them. In our discussion just before we started recording, you let me know that that's actually something that's been done already, is it not?
Yeah, definitely something that's been done. So the concept of old growth was talked about more under the guise of virgin or climax, and we kind of blended never cut or never farmed or never damaged with the concept of moving towards shade tolerant species and being the right habitat for the soils in the ecoregion. And then in the Northwest, clearing started, and they said, boy, this is kind of looking hinky. We better figure out what's going on up here. It's obviously having an effect. And so they did a bunch of comprehensive studies in the Northwest and the West Coast. And what they came away with seemed to influence eastern United States forest ideas for a long time. And eventually, in the 80s and 90s, the Forest Service decided we need to write our own definitions for the East. It grew in popularity. A series of papers came out from the various forest regions, the Northeast and the Southeast and maybe the Midwest area. And basically what they were is like community by community, different tree cover types each had their own metrics assigned to them, kind of minimal metrics. And they were meant to be exclusionary rather than inclusionary. So the Forest Service seems at times to have wanted less forest to be considered old growth, but they're not too bad. They're pretty easy to attain. And what they found was there are measurable points where you can say, okay, this forest has begun to look like the original forest did. And they wrote papers which focused on microsites. They would say, okay, at this particular tract, these are the features, and they would bring them together into meta-analyses and say, at sites like this, these tend to be the features. And that was it. We wrote that down. We tallied them up for all the forests in our region. We said how many acres went back to certain stand ages, and then sometimes we confirmed that with diameters to check to make sure they kind of added up or some of the metrics were right physically. And then I don't know what happened after that. So it seems like everybody forgot they existed. A woman named Mary Bird Davis wrote a survey of old growth in the East and kind of worked on the coattails of this in 1997, I guess, in 2003. And then there's been kind of nobody who's ever gone back and looked at it. And we've gotten away from using the climax terms and from using the terms of of succession. We sound less like the Northwest here when we talk about old growth today, but almost no one talks about it. There's very few papers that come out that are willing to put a stamp on it and say, this is old, this is original. So I have my own opinions about what it should mean.
Well, let's hear that. What is your opinion on how that should be defined?
Yeah, so I think that really what the layperson has to understand is that you could have trees of any size, trees of any shape, and still have something which was less touched or untouched by man. And really what we're all getting at is a sense of something intact and which behaves in a way model enough that we can use it to describe future changes. And so in a lot of state agencies, they call this natural heritage. Natural heritage areas are those areas which have often rare species, rare habitats, rare hydrography, weird stream systems, karst, and all these things work together synergistically to make areas that are unmitigable, irreplaceable. We can't get them back. And further, they're germane to the conversation. They're not just random microcosms. They're little pieces of what we should be studying today, what we would have been hundreds of years ago. And so, old growth should be centered around the idea of an area which is still functioning like it should, so that we can study it and determine how we should plan for the future, so we don't lose those virtuous characters of it. And so that's what I'm always chasing. I look for oftentimes the rare plants on the ground and say, well, the trees add up after. But oftentimes I can tell you from the plants on the ground whether a site's been disturbed much more quickly than the trees above. The trees above are just a simple signpost for the layperson to say, yep, big trees equals old trees equals site that's undisturbed. And if it was that simple, it would be a lot easier.
So when you say a site that's undisturbed, are you talking about specifically development where maybe, well, for example, we talked about Kisatchie Forest. I mean, Kisatchie Forest really isn't that old. It's areas that have been clear-cut in the late 19th, early 20th century. And so a lot of that has been replanted, 100 years maybe.
Yeah, so there are ecosystems. So what you're saying is a big broad brush statement that is applicable to the vast majority of acreage in Kisatchie. It is not a writ large statement that holds water. So okay. Smith and a few others, Lattimore Smith, a great worker in our natural heritage, and others did surveys that basically said, let's try and find in every single forest stand the best and niftiest areas, and then in each of these stands that are good reference sites, we'll describe them and we'll rank them, basically A+ down to F. And so they went under these studies for probably 10 years through the 90s, and they found that there were hundreds of acres which approximated the descriptions of old growth along bottoms and along streams in areas that were hard to cut, all the classic stories, right?
Right.
There were fewer acres that were upland longleaf or longleaf pine savanna that matched up to those characters, but there were a few patches, and today we can quibble about how they came to existence. A forest could be under the guise virgin because it blew down the year before everything else was cut. It'd never been cut. It was blown down at the time. So too could a forest be uncut, but have experienced so many windstorms in recent time that the average forester would walk right past it and know nothing of it. So they found hundreds of acres of forest that were pretty natural. In fact, some of them really, really awesome. But also we started to open our mind a little bit and see undisturbed land in other forms. We found bogs, hillside seepage bogs that were basically undescribed as science. We found prairies that were undescribed as science. We found out that the ground flora was 10 times more diverse and more important than the overstory of the longleaf pine. We found out that the longleaf pine and the shortleaf pine were quite similar, and the shortleaf pine and longleaf pine blended into the coastal prairie. And so we found all these things, and we realized basically this motif: undisturbed, meaning not plowed, not deeply farmed, not heavily grazed. If it needs fire, not without fire. If it's damaged by fire, no fire in it. Not cut if the overstory composition affects what's on the ground. So if it needs shade, you shouldn't cut it. If all these things have affected it very little, then oftentimes we find that there is a plethora of things there that are found almost nowhere else. So we call these remnants. In remnants, you often have things that are absent from our landscape today, and they're exceedingly rare because of that. So undisturbed just means that, like, nothing done to it that we can't have put together the pieces of in just our natural model. We can't make it happen naturally.
So it's easy to tell if an area was once farmed, like you had mentioned, or used as grazing for cattle. You could tell the difference in the fauna, whether it's been disturbed in that way.
We can certainly guess at it, and I can't always be sure, but we know little anecdotes like cows don't tend to eat ironweed, Vernonia. So if we walk into a prairie and it's full of Vernonia and doesn't have any of the big, yummy ice cream prairie grasses like gamma grass and big blue stem, well, I got a pretty good idea of what happened to the big grasses and why the ironweed is left. And those effects can last for decades and be scars on the land that we can kind of read later on. If a forest, this is especially noteworthy up north, if a forest is covered in pit and mound topography, this microtopography from when the trees blow over, they pick up dirt and they leave a hole behind. A natural forest may have many iterations 1,000 years old of these. Some may be 6 inches tall because they've weathered down, and the pits may be almost inevident, and others may be 10 feet tall and have just happened yesterday. And this is the natural case of a forest that is prone to blowdown. Like our bottomland hardwoods are kind of like that. A lot of our hill slope forests are like that. Well, if we walk into a forest and it's pretty level land, would have been arable, would have been good to farm or good to graze, and there's no pit and mound topography, or there's pimple mounds on the ground that should be a natural undulation in the surface. These grow in our prairies a lot. But all the microtopography is gone, and it's just all level. Or more importantly, if we find cultural artifacts like fences that divided into paddocks of a size typical for row crop agriculture or farming, then yeah, we can guess. One of the easiest guesses is to look at the trees and say, do these trees predate most of the types of development which would have damaged this site? And if they do, how many trees per acre? Therefore, at what density would the effects have come? And so we can guess. We can't say for sure. It's not easy.
Interesting. You have a passion for searching for these large trees. You have had a chance to record several state champions since you and I have met. So that, I think, is a wonderful thing. It is curious, though, how do you go about searching for these large trees?
First, a note as to why I search for large trees.
Better question. Okay, let's try it. Let's do that first.
So remember I said they're the signpost for lay people. Well, I'm a lay person, right? I don't have any special prescience that others lack. I know, though, that where this...
Well, you have certain experiences that most lay people probably would not have, and certainly a curiosity that is unique to this particular field.
Right, but the tools are still my own as they are their own. So the big trees still suggest potential for being less disturbed to me. So I'm often looking for the big trees because I saw something on a topo map where the land cover didn't change for a very long period of time, or where I know a hill slope prevents development, or because I'm looking for remnants, I often find big trees. And wheresoever I should find big trees that aren't in a garden or a yard or a zoo, there too will I search for remnants. And so they're really a part and parcel of my work to try and find natural areas. So that's how I find them. And I guess I find them mostly by just knowing the species. I think most of the foresters pass up a good deal of red oaks under a block mentality and say, "Oh, that's a red oak," or this is a fair-sized pine, but I've seen pines grow to that size, in 20 years in my loblolly stand. It was, okay, well, this isn't loblolly, this is longleaf, and so I guess I just, I think I recognize the species more than most people. So when I pass a nutmeg hickory tree, I less often say, well, that's a pretty good size hickory of some type. I say, boy, that's probably the national champion nutmeg, because they just don't get very big. And so, yeah, I guess that's how I do it.
In your hunt for large trees, I think you've mentioned that you use Google Maps a lot. Is that just one of the tools that you use? I guess, where do you get inspiration or curiosity to say, well, I'm going to look in Arcadia Parish?
The spies would have to cut you off right here and say you're getting into tactics and methodology. I can't tell you anymore. No, so it's easy to tell what areas might be less disturbed if you drive any road. If you drive a road and you see a bunch of forests that have diameters over 20 or 25 inches average for the overstory trees, well, I might put that down in a little notebook in my pocket and say, I should look at that on Google Earth one day. If I see an area that looks and I say, boy, that'd be hard to cut, or that soil sucks. I bet trees don't grow very fast on that. I may just take note of that and go look it up later. And then other times I just kind of veg out at the computer and say, boy, all this area is a different color green in the 2010 aerial photography. I wonder how come. I wonder what composition led to that. Or I say, boy, this is a soil type that I can see on aerial photos that should be affecting the soil. I wonder if it has salt in it. Should be changing something, you know. And so I put all these pieces together, and I get ideas of where I should go, or I pass the sites on the side of the road, and I get ideas of where I should look back on Google Earth. And then I site check them. And when I site check them, I may say, oh, wow, well, that site's pretty cool. But this site over here, this back 40, that's perfectly homogeneous in shape, has obvious snags in the canopy with the leaf on aerial photos. The topography is even rougher. I say, boy, I got to get in there. And so I get on the phone. I say, hey, landowner, I'm nobody. I'm not going to hurt anything. Just let me look at your trees. And they do. So that's how I end up there, I guess. Topo maps. John Michael is a big fan of paper maps. I like paper maps.
I like that. Paper maps are a forest product.
That's right. And you get to annotate them in the field, in the rain, any time of the day. You know, you don't have to have the internet connection. But I have all kinds of overlays, and I often increase the contour interval on Google Earth so I can see 1 meter contours, which are really useful for small plants that, you know, like a particular type of cliff shape, or they like to be where the water is. So you need to know where the reentrants are into the side of the hill and this sort of thing. I often color code maps for vegetation and things like this so I can pick out the areas of most interest. Just really boring sitting at the computer with your coffee cup kind of stuff, you know.
I do want to make something very clear, because you've really stressed this in our conversations, that you always seek the landowner and you always seek permission from the landowner before you do anything.
Right.
So you're not going to see him walking across someone's property that he doesn't have permission to be on.
Worst thing that can happen is I find a really cool site and then screw up the landowner contact. You know, that'd be the worst thing, because then I know it's there and I can't study it. And so, you know, it's better to know it's there and know that when the landowners change hands, you know, when the land changes hands, or when someone more charismatic than me comes along, if that ever happens, maybe they'll get a shoe in, you know. But the worst thing is to know that I screwed it up and there's something valuable out there that I just cut everybody else off from. So I'm real sensitive to that.
What has been the response from landowners when you've approached them?
Well, I talk pretty fast, but other than that, they like me. I guess that normally people say yes. They either have technical difficulties. I quipped this in the interview. They either can't hear me on the phone, or they can give me permission to their property. I find a lot of older landowners because it's the case that the back 40 gets set aside by the last child who lives at the property when all the parents are gone and this sort of thing. And so I often find land that is undisturbed for so long that only old people can tell me about how long it's been undisturbed. And so this is kind of intimate to it. I get along with the elderly and the geriatric pretty well. My sisters are all 10 to 15 years older than me, and my parents had me at 40 something. And so maybe I'm an old soul. Who knows? I like coffee.
Sounds like it.
We just sit down and talk a lot of times. I'll just go into a living room with a landowner and just talk about how come that last patch of their forest isn't cut, or why they don't graze cattle on a particular spot. And so that works out well for me. I get to learn a lot.
Well, I think your curiosity is certainly genuine, and many landowners love to talk about their property. It's something that is near and dear to them. They have a passion for what they own.
They have the same passions that I have, right? They grew up squirrel hunting their family land just like I grew up squirrel hunting little patches. They shot mistletoe out of their trees and recall which ones, just as I shot mistletoe out of the trees for Christmas with my dad. And so I guess I just am able to tap into what seems to remind people of their forested youth, you know. And so it's not just forest for me. I get into other areas, but regardless, it's always some sentimental attachment that people have. If they don't have a sentimental attachment to this property, it's not there. It's just gone. I mean, I usually find that if they're either absentee landowners and they'll still have, you know, sentimental recollection, or they've been living on that place since they were 2 years old.
Tell us a little bit about your most challenging landowner to seek permission to walk the property.
Boy, that's tough. Well, in my neighborhood when I was young, there was a person who had a nice persimmon tree. And one time, it was a fuyu persimmon. I like the native persimmons, but I'll settle for a fuyu where there's 50 on one small tree. And I asked this woman in her driveway one day, she was real grouchy. I said, hey, let me get one of those persimmons. And she said, yeah, sure thing, but only one. And don't you come back here again asking for persimmons every day. I was like 10 years old. And she pulled out of the driveway and she left. And I walked up to the Fuyu persimmon tree and I put my hand around a nice ripe persimmon, just barely hanging on in the winter. And the old man walked out and said, "What are you doing in my yard?" And his wife hadn't told him why I was there. And so they always scowl at me when I drive through the neighborhood still today. That's been like 15 years ago. So that's the worst case I ever had. No, I've had people that knew what I was doing right over the fence and knew that it was cool and knew that I found cool stuff. And I could put all the stamped flyers in their mailbox that I wanted to. And I could leave them small tokens of flowers and things that I'd found on the adjacent land, and they just never got back with me, or worse yet, they'd sit on the fence line and just kind of look at me from afar. And so sometimes there's people that I know that have cool stuff on their land, but they just have an ignorant, negative opinion of me. They don't know me, so that's the worst. Usually, if I can get them on the phone, they either have the classic misgivings like insurance or something like this. They're scared, and I can talk them out of it, or maybe not. Maybe I can just say, hey, if you ever want somebody back here in 10 years, you call me. I'll still be alive, or otherwise they let me on. It's been pretty easy.
What has been I guess maybe the biggest turnaround of a hesitant landowner yet has really discovered, well, when you share with them what you've discovered on their property and they just turn, what's the excitement like for that?
The Corps of Engineers is one that's kind of like that. The Corps of Engineers in my area has some old forests that I cored under a collection permit and determined they were old, and they also have some prairies that are pretty awesome in my nearby WMA, and it's cooperative between them and the Wildlife and Fisheries. And when I first came to them, they looked at me cross-eyed. They had no idea what I was talking about, and still today they may be, warming up to the idea, but they talk to me. And they ask me questions, and they come to me with their ideas, be they brilliant or less, and so it's cool. One day they're asking me if they should plant milkweed in their prairie, which has 5 species of milkweed by road. They don't need to plant anything, and I have to bark at them for that. And the next day they're telling me their burn plans just a year later, and it's like, well, okay, now you've made some significant improvements here. This is looking really nice. You get it, at least a little bit. And I've had people that once told me, "Oh, there's no old trees where you're going. You'll never find anything." 6 months later, they call me back and say, "Hey, you know what? I was walking in that area, and you'll never believe what I found. I found this big old tree with this huge." And so, anyways, people can really flip flop. I think that they just haven't heard a lot of the things I'm talking about most of the time. So,
what is your most unique find in some of these areas?
There's a number of ways to measure unique storylines. I guess one of my coolest finds is this. I like prairies, I like grasslands, and I like forest. I was studying this forest that had big giant beech and big giant basswood and big giant red oaks, nuttall oak, big trees. It's going to have the state champion of like 3 trees, and they blew down in a storm. But just upslope from the small ravine stream where all these big trees grew, there's a flat, and in the flat there grew what would soon become the state champion nutmeg hickory. And also these post oak trees, not very big, 30 inches in diameter. You have a bigger post oak in your back pasture, no doubt, but everyone does, it seems. But they're old, like stupid old. Like 180 was nothing. 240, 260 was pretty common, probably a couple trees per acre in that age range. And I thought to myself, how did this get saved? So I said, well, okay, it's section 16. But only half of it was section 16. Okay, well, that doesn't make sense. It's
just a real quick, 16 section land is land set aside by each school board district so that they can have resources for the benefit of the school system.
That's right. Of course. Yeah. Let them know. And most of it's been sold off. But for a long time, that was where you had really cool stuff happening. It was because it was just kind of untouched from early times. So part of it was Section 16, but that didn't make sense. And some of the pine trees were not very old. In fact, the loblolly pines were stupid short because the soil was harsh. They were like 90 feet tall and like 26 inches in diameter, but they're like 115. It's like, okay, well, something's really going on here. And I should have put the pieces together, but I didn't. And it took until they cleared the adjacent forest for me to realize what had happened. And what happened was when they cleared that forest, they didn't site prep it, they didn't burn it, they didn't plow it, but all the wildflowers came back. And I realized that it was all a savanna. It was a post oak savanna or a post oak woodland. 200 years ago, it had been open. Those trees were scattered at a couple per acre because that's as dense as they were. There were no trees in between them. And when fire stopped, the trees grew up. And 115, 120 years ago, it got so mesic that even the loblolly pines could come up in the gaps. And so it looked nothing like a prairie or a woodland or anything of that type until they cleared the adjacent lot. And then it all clicked. I understood why it had happened. And so that's a really cool storyline. That's two super rare ecosystems side by side, and why they occur. Like we know the whole beginning to end there. That doesn't happen very often.
So really, you discover stories as well.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, it's all stories. Forester systems, and so they have their cycles. And so my job is to jump in somewhere in the cycle and say, how did we get here? That's detective work, I guess.
In your discoveries, are there sites that the public has access to that would be a wonderful visit for them?
There are definitely areas. Remember, I told you about the study, which is very closely guarded, done on Kisatchie. Every district had this study, and it's hard for me to get information about it. It's very, very tight-lipped. But basically, they found that any of the intermediate streams were aligned with a lot of trees that were either unmerchantable, they were too large, or if they weren't too large, they were hollow, or if they weren't hollow, they were too small because they had blown down before. Or for various reasons, there's 150 to 200-year-old trees scattered along creeks. When I say scattered, sometimes they extend 10 feet off the creek. Sometimes they cover 20 or 30 acres, 40 acres along the creek or more. In fact, one area I know of has hundreds of acres of scattered old trees, and there's not much evidence of harvest. And so Kisatchie National Forest, find an intermediate stream and walk it, and I'm sure you'll find really cool stuff. Don't forget that grasslands can be old growth. I know forestry guys, it may not hit home for you, but when you go to Kisatchie and you see their wind prairies, just know that you're standing in something really old, like way older than us, that just missed getting destroyed. I recently found an old patch at a national wildlife refuge, Bayou Cocodrie National Wildlife Refuge. We don't know much about it yet, but we know that it's big, like really big. You have to walk in like 3.5 miles or go by boat 3 miles, and it's really harsh terrain. And what we found were many willow oaks up to like 60 inches in diameter. So huge 5-foot diameter trees, gigantic snags, so standing dead trees, and logs on the ground up to your hip high, and dense cane, and really old stuff. It's obvious, but the reason it hasn't been studied, hopefully I can crack that case, the reason it hasn't been studied is because it's just so far away, and the public doesn't know about it. The public never thought, boy, I wish they'd study that so I can know more about it. It's great deer hunting, great squirrel hunting, probably be good trapping and fishing too, but it's just so far away that it made it, but nobody knows about it. And so that's kind of the curious case that occurs.
And where is that?
It's in Concordia Parish.
Okay.
I would say also Tunica Hills has some scattered old stuff. There's a stand of virgin cypress that I wish the state would open up. It's a state preserve near Lucky, Louisiana. Has 1,200 plus year old trees. Bayou Bodcaw has some really old trees in it, and it probably I've seen trees that are 800 probably. Just scattered. Maybe you hit an acre that has 15 of them. It's like, well, okay, that's better than the rest of the acres we got, And so you get into those places, it's pretty special. There's a guy named Harvey Stern with the Louisiana Purchase Cypress Legacy Foundation. He's asked me before to help him placard at least one tree per parish that predates the purchase. That's pretty cool. And so I think that's a good place for people to start. And then if you want to see some old growth, I teach a class with the Coastal Plains Outdoor School in the spring, and basically the class focuses on identifying old growth, and we teach it at Chico State Park. Chico State Park, the state arboretum that Caroline Dorman heard about less than a week before she went to Congress and said, hey, we should set this aside. It was the first state arboretum in the country, as I understand it. That area has some really amazing old trees. I found 2 state champions there last year, the state champion beech and the state champion Caria glabra. Pignut hickory, that's what it is. Yeah.
Okay.
So
yeah.
Those areas are really awesome. They're free. They're open to the public. You can get into them, and I think people should just go take a look, see what you think.
So, how do they learn more about these things?
I host a great class. No, I would say really
Give
and truly.
yourself a plug. When is it? Where do you teach it? Tell us a little bit about what do you teach.
Yeah, so in January, if a person was on the Facebook page for the Coastal Plains Outdoor School run by Matthew Herron, I teach a class with him there. And we can also see notes about it on the Louisiana Native Plant Society Facebook page. And basically, it's a whole day class, and I hand out 6 pages of my handcrafted tools that tell you how to guess at the age of trees, give you a kind of a calculator to decide whether forests are old or not, and you just learn to put your detective eyes on and see for the first time, kind of paint those pictures, tell those stories. And then at the bottom is my phone number, and you can call me if you find something cool. It's a really good day out for everybody, I think. I really just want people to just start looking for big trees and stand next to one and appreciate it. I'm really not a bleeding heart, but it's a part of our heritage. We're a state that had really fantastic natural areas. We're the sportsman's paradise, after all. And I don't think we should let that go. I think that appreciating our forests for their maximal dimensions, as big as they can get, as old as they can get, is one way we can pay tribute to that. So.
John Michael Kelley, amateur botanist and big tree hunter. Thanks
right.
you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you for listening to Mind of the Forest, a podcast of the Louisiana Forestry Association. If you'd like to learn more about sustainable forestry, the LFA and its programs, and how you can be part of an organization that supports landowners, loggers, and wood manufacturers in Louisiana, go to our website, www.laforestry.com. Questions and comments can be sent via email to jzeringue, jzeringue, @laforestry.com. And remember, at the Louisiana Forestry Association, we're minding the forest for you.